The room fell into an uneasy silence as Marcus Monroe's voice cut through the polished air of Marston's bistro. "My mother was told there was no room for her until you saw who she was," he said, his words heavy with restrained fire. And in that charged moment, every head turned, every heart raced, and the truth that everyone had tried to ignore could no longer be hidden. It was the kind of afternoon that made the air feel heavy, thick like molasses, the kind of southern heat that soaked into your skin and stayed there. Charleston's cobblestone streets shimmered under the weight of the sun, and the occasional breeze off the harbor was too weak to do anything but stir the scent of blooming jasmine and hot pavement. On a quieter side street, tucked between art galleries and antique shops, sat Marston's Bistro, a polished little restaurant where the glass gleamed and the menu was written in looping gold script. The kind of place where you didn't just eat, you arrived. That's where Evelyn Monroe found herself that Thursday. 72 years old, she moved with a kind of quiet dignity that didn't demand attention but commanded it all the same. She wore a pale lavender dress, the color soft against her deep brown skin, and low-heeled white shoes that made a faint tapping sound with each careful step. In her right hand, she clutched a worn leather hat, battered and loved, the last piece of her late husband she still carried everywhere. Her silver hair was pinned neatly at the back of her head, catching the afternoon light as she pulled open the heavy glass door of the bistro and stepped inside. The cool air inside hit her like a wall, tinged with the smell of expensive cologne and fresh-baked bread. The restaurant wasn't busy, maybe a third of the tables were filled. A young couple near the windows shared a quiet laugh over glasses of iced tea, and a few businessmen in pressed shirts murmured over their laptops. A waiter in a crisp black apron breezed by carrying a tray of gleaming silverware. Evelyn let her eyes adjust to the dimmer light and then took a step toward the hostess stand, her shoes clicking softly against the polished floor. That's when he spotted her. Chase Reynolds, the host, barely out of college, stood leaning against the podium like he owned the place. His brown hair was slicked back a little too carefully, and the practiced smirk he wore never quite reached his eyes. He clocked her in an instant, the careful dress, the old hat, the deliberate steps, and decided what he needed to know. In his mind, Evelyn wasn't a guest, she was a problem. An interruption. Someone who didn't belong in a place like Marston's. Evelyn smiled gently as she reached the stand. She waited patiently for Chase to notice her properly, to greet her like any other guest. But he didn't smile back. He didn't even really look at her. Instead, he pulled out a small black reservation book, flicked his finger down a page without reading it, and said, voice flat and disinterested, "Private event today, ma'am." "Sorry, we're full." The words hung in the air for a moment, sharper than they had any right to be. Evelyn felt the sting of them, but she didn't flinch. She had weathered worse in her lifetime, much worse. Her smile didn't waver, though something in her eyes grew quieter. She glanced around the room. Empty tables along the windows. 2 more along the back wall. "Private event," he said. "Full," he said. She turned back to him, her voice warm, touched by years of grace and patience. "I believe my son made arrangements." "There's a luncheon today?" Chase shrugged without meeting her eyes. "Reservations only," he said, dismissive. Evelyn's hand tightened slightly around the brim of the leather hat. She could feel it, the prickle of attention. A few heads turned. Conversation softened. Forks paused halfway to mouths. No one said anything, not yet. But something had shifted, a crack in the surface tension of the room. Chase was already half-turned, ready to walk away, when Evelyn spoke again, her tone still kind but firm. "Sir, I'm quite certain. My son reserved a table here for a luncheon." Chase gave a tight, fake smile, the kind that said he was humoring her and hated every second of it. "Like I said, ma'am," he said louder, "we're booked. Maybe you could try somewhere else." He didn't offer suggestions. He didn't pretend to care. It wasn't his problem. Evelyn stood there, still and composed. The leather hat pressed closer to her chest. She could feel the burn rising up her neck, but it wasn't embarrassment, it was that quiet, heavy anger she had carried with her for decades, the kind you wear like a second skin because life demands it. Where exactly do you suggest I go? She asked, her voice soft but unyielding. Dressed like this, with no car, in this heat. Chase said nothing. His eyes darted toward the kitchen like he had more important things to do than deal with her. Around them, diners watched but stayed rooted in their seats, the discomfort crackling in the air. A woman sitting at the bar shifted uneasily, stealing a glance at her husband, who sipped his drink and kept his gaze firmly elsewhere. Evelyn knew this feeling too well. It was the same feeling she had known sitting in waiting rooms, stepping into department stores, standing at bus stops. The silent decision by strangers to look through her, past her, around her, but never at her. Still, she stood a little taller. She wasn't going anywhere. I'll wait here, she said simply. Chase gave a small, exasperated laugh and disappeared behind the swinging doors to the kitchen. Evelyn remained, a lone figure by the stand, small but unshakable. She pressed her late husband's hat closer to her heart and lifted her chin just slightly. Behind her, a voice, hesitant, kind, broke the silence. "Ma'am, you are welcome to sit with us if you'd like." Evelyn turned. A woman, maybe in her mid-60s with kind brown eyes and a nervous smile, sat at a table near the bar. Beside her, a teenage boy stared wide-eyed, clearly unsure what to say. Evelyn smiled, a real, genuine smile, and shook her head gently. "Thank you, dear," she said. "But I'll wait for my son." And wait she did. The minutes stretched long and thin. The clatter of silverware, the murmur of low conversations, the shuffle of waiters moving just a little too quickly, every sound seemed louder in the tense space that surrounded her. The eyes of the room flickered back to their plates, their drinks, their phones, anything to pretend they hadn't witnessed what they had witnessed. Then, at last, the door swung open with a force that rattled the little brass bell above it. Heads turned, almost against their will. And walked Marcus Monroe, tall and broad-shouldered in a tailored charcoal suit, a man who knew exactly how much space he took up and wasn't afraid to claim it. His skin was the rich, deep brown of his mother's, his hair cropped short and neat, and the heavy watch on his wrist caught the light as he moved. Marcus spotted his mother immediately, and he saw Chase too, lounging near the kitchen door, pretending to busy himself with a tablet. Marcus' jaw tightened, a subtle clench that barely showed but said everything. He crossed the floor in long, deliberate strides, bent down, and kissed Evelyn lightly on the cheek. "Sorry I'm late, Mama," he said, his voice low and warm. Evelyn smiled at him, small and private, her fingers lingering for a second longer than usual on his sleeve. Marcus straightened and turned to Chase, his expression unreadable. "We have a reservation," he said, voice calm but carrying easily across the room. "Monroe. Private luncheon." For half a heartbeat, Chase looked like he might argue. His mouth opened, then closed. His eyes flickered to Marcus' Rolex, to the leather briefcase hanging from his hand. Something clicked behind them. Yes, sir," Chase stammered, flipping quickly through his reservation book. "Right this way." Marcus didn't move. He let the silence stretch just long enough for everyone in the restaurant, the whisperers, the watchers, the ones pretending to be deaf, to feel it settle heavy on their skin. "My mother," Marcus said, voice sharp but steady, "was told there was no room for her. Funny how that changes." The words didn't shout. They didn't need to. They struck like a stone thrown into glass. Chase flushed beet red. I'm sorry, sir. I didn't realize." "You realized exactly what you wanted to realize," Marcus said coolly. A beat of thick, shamed silence followed. Diners shifted awkwardly in their seats. The manager, a short woman with a headset tucked behind her ear, hovered near the bar but didn't step forward. Evelyn touched her son's arm again, a small, calming gesture. A reminder of who she was, of who they were. "We'll find our table," she said softly. Marcus nodded but let his gaze sweep across the room one more time. Not angry. Not bitter. Just seeing them, really seeing them, before turning and walking beside his mother toward the private dining room, where a different kind of welcome waited. And behind them, the restaurant sat in its uneasy silence, every clink of a fork a reminder that some lessons don't come easy, but they come all the same. The heavy oak doors swung open with a slow groan, revealing a warmly lit private room tucked away at the back of Marston's bistro. Evelyn Monroe stepped through first, her hand still resting lightly on Marcus's arm. The shift in atmosphere was immediate. Gone was the cold indifference of the main dining room. Here, the air buzzed with genuine warmth and admiration. Soft golden lights spilled over framed photographs lining the walls, images of Evelyn shaking hands with governors, standing proud on courthouse steps, leading marches down streets where justice had once been only a whispered hope. A long white banner stretched across the far wall, simple but powerful, honoring Evelyn Monroe, a legacy of justice and grace. The applause started the moment she entered, a ripple that grew into a standing ovation. Marcus paused just behind her, giving his mother the moment she had more than earned. Evelyn, for her part, smiled politely, dipping her head in acknowledgement, but she didn't bask in it. The weight of the encounter outside still clung to her, quiet and heavy. She carried it the way she had carried 1,000 other moments like it, silent, unseen by the crowds that only ever witnessed the victories, never the battles that came before them. She moved gracefully toward the head table, where a place had been set for her, a delicate bouquet of magnolias waiting at her seat. Familiar faces rose to greet her, former colleagues from the courts, young attorneys she had mentored, city officials whose careers she had quietly shaped with a firm word or a pointed introduction. Their smiles were warm, their eyes bright with admiration, but Evelyn knew better than to mistake admiration for understanding. As she sat, Marcus took the chair beside her, his large hand resting protectively on the back of her chair for a moment before he eased into his seat. The luncheon began with the usual clatter of silverware and soft bursts of polite laughter. Plates of shrimp and grits, slices of cornbread, and glasses of sweet tea made their rounds. Servers moved a little too briskly, still rattled by whatever whisper of trouble had carried over from the front of the restaurant. Evelyn said little at first, offering small smiles and nods, her hands folded neatly in her lap, the worn leather hat placed carefully on the chair beside her like an honored guest. She listened as speaker after speaker stood up to sing her praises. They spoke of her first black woman to argue a landmark housing rights case in the state, first to sit on the city's Human Rights Commission, first to open her own practice when no firm would hire her. They spoke of the battles she had fought in courtrooms, on city streets, and smoky back rooms where decisions that shaped lives were made behind closed doors. But none of them spoke of the smaller battles, the quiet humiliations, the 1,000 small dismissals that left no scars but shaped a life just the same. They didn't know about the time she had waited hours for interviews only to be told the position had been filled, about the sales clerks who had followed her around stores, about the bank officers who smiled thinly and stamped denied on loan applications without a second glance. They saw the victories, not the costs. Evelyn smiled and nodded as they spoke, but inside, she felt the familiar ache, the knowledge that the hardest parts of her story were invisible even now. Still, she bore it as she always had, with dignity stitched deep into every seam of her being. Finally, the program's host, a graying attorney she had once mentored fresh out of law school, rose to the podium. His voice shook slightly with emotion as he introduced her. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "it is my distinct honor to invite to the stage the woman whose shoulders we all stand on, the incomparable Evelyn Monroe." The room rose again to its feet. Evelyn stood slowly, smoothing the front of her dress, her movements deliberate, graceful. She left the hat behind for now. As she stepped to the podium, she didn't need notes. She didn't need a microphone. When she began to speak, her voice, though soft, filled the room, pulling everyone toward her like a tide. "Thank you," she said simply, her eyes sweeping the room, landing on face after face that had known her victories but not her battles. "This honor humbles me. But I must tell you, awards, titles, ceremonies, they aren't the real measure of a life." A hush fell so deep you could hear the clink of a fork dropped somewhere near the back. "The real measure," she continued, her voice steady, "is how you treat the people you think can do nothing for you. It's not about how you behave when everyone is watching. It's about how you act when no one is." She paused, letting the words settle. The weight of them seemed to thicken the air. Marcus watched her, pride and something heavier tightening his chest. Kindness, Evelyn said, her hands resting lightly on the podium, isn't a performance. Respect isn't a prize we hand out only to those we think deserve it. It's a reflection of who we are, not who they are. True dignity, she said, her voice dropping slightly, is how we choose to see each other when the world tells us to look away. Silence blanketed the room, thick and absolute. Some people shifted in their seats, swallowing hard. Others simply watched her, wide-eyed. I have lived through decades where the law said one thing and people said another, Evelyn said quietly. I have walked into rooms where my name opened the door, but my face almost closed it again. I have smiled when my heart ached, held my head high when my knees wanted to give out, and I have forgiven when forgiveness felt impossible. She smiled then, a small, knowing curve of her lips. And I would do it all again. Because change, she said, is not won in grand gestures. It is built, brick by brick, in the smallest of human moments. Moments where we choose to be better. She stepped back from the podium, and for a beat the room remained frozen, as if no one quite dared to break the moment. Then, as if released by a single unseen signal, the audience rose, the sound of their applause roaring in Evelyn's ears. But she didn't bask in it. She simply nodded once, her heart steady, her spirit full, and returned to her seat beside Marcus. He rose with the others, clapping slowly, deliberately, his eyes never leaving his mother's face. Around them, the celebration continued, plates of cake appeared, cameras flashed, a few polite interviews were given. But Evelyn sat quietly, sipping sweet tea, her gaze drifting to the heavy oak doors that led back to the main dining room. She thought of Chase Reynolds. She thought of all the people who had turned their eyes away. And she thought of all the ones who had quietly chosen to see, to act, even if it was just offering her a seat at their table. Beside her, Marcus leaned in, his voice low. You want me to say something to him? To the manager? Evelyn smiled, the kind of smile that held decades of battles fought and forgiven. No, baby, she said. Some lessons are best learned sitting with their own discomfort. He nodded, understanding more than words could say. Outside the windows, the sunlight had begun to soften, painting long gold streaks across the cobblestones. The afternoon was slipping into evening, and with it, the moment began to settle deep into the bones of the people who had witnessed it. They wouldn't forget it. Not today. Maybe not ever. And Evelyn Monroe, with her quiet, unbreakable grace, had never needed anything more. The last of the applause had faded into a hum of soft conversations and clinking glasses, but Evelyn Monroe remained seated by the window, her fingers loosely curled around a sweating glass of sweet tea. The late afternoon sun slanted low through the tall windows, casting long golden beams across the polished wood floors and brushing her silver hair with a halo of light. Marcus sat quietly beside her, his chair angled slightly toward hers, watching the way she studied the street outside, as if she were seeing something beyond the slow-moving tourists and the lazy drift of horse-drawn carriages. He didn't press her to speak. He knew his mother's silences were as full of meaning as her words. After a while, Evelyn set the glass down with a soft clink and reached for the old leather hat that had sat patiently on the chair beside her throughout the celebration. She ran her fingers slowly along its cracked brim, her touch gentle, reverent. Marcus rose first, pushing back his chair and offering his arm. Evelyn accepted it with a small smile, rising with the same careful grace she had shown all her life. Together, they made their way toward the heavy oak doors, each step steady, measured. Behind them, a few guests called out warm farewells, but Evelyn only dipped her head in acknowledgement, her mind already moving beyond the room and its celebration. The real test, she knew, waited outside. As they pushed through the front entrance of Marston's Bistro, the heat of the Charleston afternoon wrapped around them again, thick and syrupy. The street had changed while they were inside, the shadows were longer now, the colors of the city muted under the soft, aging sunlight. Evelyn stepped onto the sidewalk, feeling the familiar tug of humidity against her skin, the comforting unevenness of the cobblestones beneath her sensible shoes. And then she saw him. Chase Reynolds stood a few feet away, awkward and small in a way that had nothing to do with his physical stature. His hands were shoved deep into his pockets, his shoulders slightly hunched, as if he could fold himself in half and disappear. Gone was the slick-back confidence, the casual dismissal. In its place was something rawer, clumsier, an uneasy vulnerability he didn't quite know how to carry. Evelyn slowed but didn't stop. She felt Marcus tense beside her, but she gave the faintest pressure to his arm, a silent signal. "Let me handle this." Chase shifted from one foot to the other, glanced once at Marcus's towering form, then quickly dropped his gaze to somewhere near Evelyn's shoes. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough, as if the words scraped their way up from a place he hadn't used in a long time. "Ma'am," he said, swallowing hard, I'm sorry." The words were small, almost fragile, but they hung in the air between them, real and undeniable. "I judged you," Chase said, his cheeks flushing bright red. "I didn't even think. I'm sorry." For a long, measured moment, Evelyn simply looked at him. Not with anger. Not with pity. Just a steady, quiet study, as if weighing something deeper than apology or guilt. And then she smiled, not wide, not performative, but real, warm in the way sunlight feels when it finally breaks through a long stretch of gray sky. "Thank you," she said simply. 2 words. No sermon. No grand gesture. Just grace. Chase gave a jerky nod, his face a mix of relief and shame, and then, unsure what else to do, he turned and hurried back inside the restaurant, vanishing behind the glass door that thudded shut with a soft finality. Evelyn stood there for a beat longer, the old hat clutched gently against her chest, her heart steady. She didn't watch him go. She didn't need to. She had seen all she needed to see. Marcus opened the passenger door of the sleek black sedan parked along the curb, and Evelyn slid inside with the same composed ease she brought to everything. As Marcus rounded the car and slipped behind the wheel, he glanced at her. Expecting, maybe hoping, for some commentary, some sharp word about justice or foolish boys learning hard lessons. But Evelyn said nothing. She simply placed the hat carefully on her lap, folded her hands neatly, and turned her face toward the window, watching as the city slid slowly past. They drove in silence for a while, the rhythmic hum of the tires over the old streets filling the space between them. Charleston's historic district unfurled outside the window, weathered brick buildings leaning against each other like old friends, iron balconies dripping with flowering vines, shop windows glowing with the soft light of the approaching evening. Finally, Marcus spoke, his voice low, hesitant. "You think he'll change?" he asked. Evelyn didn't answer right away. She watched a pair of young girls skipping down the sidewalk, their laughter high and sweet against the backdrop of a lazy saxophone drifting from a nearby cafe. "Maybe," she said at last. "Maybe not. But the important thing," she continued, her voice thoughtful, "is what he chooses when no one's watching. That's where change really lives. In the small, quiet choices we make when the world isn't clapping for us." Marcus nodded slowly, the weight of her words settling deep into his chest. He thought about all the times he had watched his mother navigate the world with quiet dignity, refusing to let bitterness take root even when the soil was rich for it. He thought about how easy it would have been for her to meet disrespect with anger, cruelty with cruelty, and how much smaller the world would have become if she had. At a stoplight, he glanced over at her again. She was still looking out the window, a small, serene smile playing at the corners of her mouth. There was a peace in her face, but not the kind that came from easy living or effortless victories. It was the hard-won peace of someone who had chosen, again and again, to be better than what the world expected. "You're something else, Mama," he said quietly. Evelyn chuckled, the sound rich and full. "I'm just tired, baby," she said, her voice light but threaded with truth. "Tired of fighting battles that should have ended a long time ago. But tired doesn't mean defeated. It just means you pick your fights a little more carefully." The light turned green, and they rolled forward, weaving through the quiet streets, past sleepy cafes and open windows where the scent of fried fish and sweet tea drifted lazily on the breeze. They didn't rush. There was no need. Some journeys deserve to be taken slow. As they crossed over a small bridge spanning a narrow canal, Evelyn reached out and patted Marcus's hand resting on the gearshift. "The world doesn't change all at once," she said. "It changes one small human decision at a time. One stranger choosing to see another. One apology offered. One forgiveness given." Marcus tightened his fingers around the steering wheel, feeling the truth of her words pulse through him like a second heartbeat. "You think he'll remember today?" he asked, more curious than cynical. Evelyn smiled again, that same soft, knowing smile. "Maybe," she said. "Or maybe he won't even realize it. Maybe it'll just be a small shift inside him. A little more kindness next time. A little less judgment." She leaned back against the seat, her eyes slipping closed for a moment. "The important part," she murmured, "is that we keep leaving those shifts behind, wherever we can." And so they drove, mother and son, through the waning light of a southern evening, carrying with them a legacy not of anger, not of bitterness, but of steadfast dignity and quiet, relentless grace. Behind them, Marston's bistro faded into the distance, just another building on just another street. But for at least one young man inside, and maybe for a few diners who had watched and listened, something had shifted. Something had changed. And that, Evelyn Monroe knew better than anyone, was how the world was rebuilt, not with grand speeches or sweeping laws, but with 1,000 small moments where someone chose to see, to act, to be better than they were the day before. Every story we tell has a deeper thread running beneath it, and today's story of Evelyn Monroe is no different. It reminds us that dignity is not something granted by others, it is something we carry within ourselves, even when the world refuses to acknowledge it. Evelyn's journey shows us that true power lies not in shouting louder than those who disrespect you, but in standing firm, calm, and unwavering when faced with injustice. There will always be moments when we are underestimated, overlooked, or treated unfairly. It is tempting to meet disrespect with anger, to let bitterness take root. But Evelyn teaches us that real change, the kind that lasts, comes from choosing grace over resentment, kindness over cruelty, and forgiveness over pride. The world often looks for transformation in grand gestures or sweeping victories. But the truth is, real transformation begins in the quiet, uncomfortable moments. It starts when one person chooses to apologize sincerely, and another chooses to forgive without bitterness. It starts when someone decides to truly see another human being, not through the lens of assumptions or prejudice, but with open eyes and an open heart. We each have the power to be part of that change. It doesn't require a title, a platform, or a podium. It requires only a willingness to act differently, to treat others with the respect and dignity they deserve, especially when no one else is looking. To all of you listening today, thank you. Thank you for taking the time to hear Evelyn's story. Thank you for reflecting on the kind of impact each small action can have. Here at U.S. Justice Story, we believe that by sharing these moments, we are planting seeds for a better world, a world built not on grand speeches, but on everyday acts of courage and kindness. If Evelyn's story touched you, I encourage you to carry it with you. The next time you face a choice between judgment and compassion, between looking away and stepping forward, remember her strength. Remember that you have the power to change a small part of the world, one quiet, courageous decision at a time. From all of us here at U.S. Justice Story, thank you for being part of this journey. We hope you'll stay with us, because the stories that need to be told, the stories of dignity, justice, and hope, are far from over.